Hey everybody, how you doing tonight? What's new? Glad you all are joining us. Glad you're joining us tonight. A lot to talk about. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to tweet this out. Make it a bigger conversation. Tweet this out on your Reddit or put this on Reddit. Put this on Facebook as a status. Tweet this out. Bring your friends. Post this in some Facebook groups. The more the merrier. A lot to talk about this evening. I've been doing these lives pretty regularly, and I thank you all for being here with us. If you feel like we're doing too much content, that's okay. That's okay. No one's obligating you to listen to everything we do as a community. Right now, there is a pandemic going on, so I'm going to spend a lot of time, chilling with all of you because, aren't many other things to do. I get up, I go to work, I go to the gym and work out. So why not just talk with my community here, with this lovely web community? So welcome. Glad you're with us. I'll do my opening remarks, and then from there I will do my roll call, and then from there I'll answer your super chat questions, and then we'll call it a night. So we'll do it that way. We'll follow our normal format. Glad you all are here. Bring your friends. Make this a bigger conversation. The more, the merrier. I'll jump right into it. I noticed, maybe you may have missed it. I missed it on Sunday, but I saw it afterwards. The New York Times did an expose of the Epoch Times. Now, it sounds a little bit weird. I said the New York Times did an expose of the Epoch Times. What is the Epoch Times? Well, the Epoch Times is a newspaper that showed up for free on the newsstands in New York City, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And it was just for free on the newsstands. And it looked like a normal newspaper, local news and all of that. But in the back, it had all this stuff against China. But not just against China, mind you, against the Chinese Communist Party. And it was later revealed that Falun Gong was pretty much run by, that the Epoch Times was pretty much run by the Falun Gong. Now, what is the Falun Gong? Well, the Falun Gong is a religious group in China. It was started by a member of the Chinese Communist Party who believed in practicing traditional medicine. And when in the 1980s, the Chinese Communist Party officially embraced science and rejected traditional medicine, and that's a whole another story we can talk about some other time. Fascinating story of the Chinese Communist Party's relationship with traditional medicine. But when the Chinese Communist Party officially said they did not believe in, traditional Chinese medicine, and the spiritual practices that go along with it, this leader of the Chinese Communist Party quit the party and started a cult, the Falun Gong. And, the Falun Gong, they believe that China is in a Dharma-ending period, right? And they are fundamentalist Buddhists, and that they believe that feudal China, the feudal system in China, is the natural order. The Communist Party, because it has women voting, it allows interracial marriage, it doesn't execute gay people, that it's violating the natural traditional way that China should be. And so they want to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party to restore the natural order. They're a very, very conservative, fanatical cult, the Falun Gong. However, because of the fact that they're Eastern, right? Because of the fact that they do exercise, and they're kind of like Tai Chi, they do a lot of exercise, and they believe you have this magical wheel in your stomach, and you do these exercises to stimulate the magical wheel, and you eat a certain way, and you chant mantras. All right, mass line in USA. All right, mass. Because you do that, the people, it was hippies they were recruiting. I mean, and I would see them in New York City. They'd be doing their exercises on the street. They'd be, handing out stuff. We're a society of people who want peace. They present themselves, not that much different than what the Moonies did, right? The Moonies are a fanatical right-wing cult aligned with Republicans, but they present themselves as, a peace movement. Not that much different than what the Tibetan separatists do, right? Again, Dalai Lama, feudalism, all kinds of things. All right, Supreme Court, right? Supreme Court, U.S. history. Um, Not that different from a lot of these groups, right? A lot of these strange hippie movements that are part of left-wing aesthetics in the United States are actually quite right-wing. The Hare Krishna movement, for example, right? Those folks are fanatical anti-communists, fanatical haters of Muslims in India, but in the United States, they're seen as this hippie, left-wing, mystical Eastern thing. This is a common pattern. So Falun Gong is this fanatical right-wing cult. Now, it was liberals that they were pandering to and liberals that they were promoting under the Obama administration. And for decades, right, they were seen as a liberal group. It was that whole crowd of anti-China fanatics from Hollywood, Richard Gere, and who else? Richard Gere and George Clooney and people like that. That's who they were pandering to. But then Donald Trump got elected, and they held off. They weren't for Trump at the beginning. But then, as it became clear that Trump was doubling down on the trade war with China, because Falun Gong exists for one reason and one reason only, to destabilize and overthrow the Chinese Communist Party, to destabilize China and bring down the socialist system, they became Trump supporters. And they started going inside of Trump rallies and handing out leaflets. Read the Epoch Times. Read the Epoch Times exposing communism daily. They started sounding like the Tea Party. They went from being hippies to being Tea Party kind of people. And they're in the Trump rallies. Read the Epoch Times. We're exposing communism daily. And they actually, this is where it all gets a little bit personal. They gave a column to Trevor Loudon. Now, I don't know if folks know who Trevor Loudon is. Trevor Loudon is a conservative born in New Zealand. And Trevor Loudon is also completely delusional. Trevor Loudon thinks that I am the mastermind behind the protest movement against Donald Trump. And he made a documentary to this effect. As Trump was being elected, he made a documentary about how I, Caleb Maupin, am the vast, conspiracy leader of the protests against Donald Trump, even though at the time I was actually opposing, and I wrote an open letter criticizing the protests. I didn't even go to the protests in Washington, D.C. opposing Donald Trump. I didn't cover them. I covered protests in New York City near Trump Tower that day. I was nowhere near those protests. I had nothing to do with planning them. I had had a falling out with the political group I was in the prior year. I had nothing to do with the protests against Trump in 2016 or when he was sworn in 2017. But regardless, that didn't stop Trevor Loudon, this nut job, from making this documentary, alleging that Caleb Maupin is the leader of the protests against the Chinese Communist Party, or against Donald Trump, because he's a communist. You watch this documentary; it's hilarious. Like I'm the man. I am the man. I'm the man behind the curtain. It's like I'm making it all happen with Kim Jong-il and Putin and President Xi Jinping and Fidel Castro. I'm sitting there going, muah, muah. It's hilarious. He really presents me like I am the puppet master of all these things in the United States. And I'm just a guy. And at the time he came out with that, it was hilarious because I was like being denounced as a Nazbol and all these awful things. I was like being widely like denounced and repudiated, but somehow, according to this documentary that Trevor Loudon made, it was so poorly researched, right? And everything he does is like 2 or 3 years behind. Caleb Maupin is the leader of the communists in the United States. It was hilarious. So they've hired this guy, right? You think if someone could get it that wrong, they might like not want to hire them. But anyway, they hired Trevor Loudon. So Trevor Loudon is churning out columns every week about writing about the communist movement in the USA, and it's embarrassing. It's like a member of the CPUSA will run for office in some state, and he'll be like, "It's illegal for a member of the Communist Party to run for office in Texas. Why hasn't he been arrested?" And it's like, that's because that law has been overturned by the Supreme Court. This isn't the 1950s, you idiot. He's a joke. The guy is a joke. And it's not just like leftists that think he's a joke. He's the guy who set up KeyWiki. It's also conservatives that think it's a joke. Now, that through media and my work in media, there are Trump people, there are conservatives that I know. When this documentary came out, I called up some Trump supporters and people that have worked in conservative media that I know. Fox News thinks this guy's a joke, okay? He's never had a Fox appearance, ever, I don't believe, right? Maybe he has, but I mean, the Fox News crowd doesn't even respect Trevor Loudon. The guy's a clown, right? He's just a clown, right? I mean, he's writing articles. Why haven't they arrested a member of the Communist Party for running for office in Texas? Because it's illegal, right? I mean, it's like that's the intellectual level of what he's writing. So they hire him, and he has a great time with me. And sometimes he writes that I'm still in the Workers' World Party, which I'm not. Other times he's put me in the League of Revolutionaries for a New America. He thinks I'm secretly a member of the League of Revolutionaries for New America, which I am not. Not part of that group. I like Nelson Peary's writing a lot. I've learned a lot from Nelson Peary, but I'm not, So this is who, the Epoch Times is talking with. And they're totally on Team Trump. So on Sunday, the New York Times exposed them and just exposed the fact that they're a crazy cult. They're homophobic. They don't believe in modern medicine. They're just this crazy fanatical Eastern cult that has set up this whole pro-Trump apparatus in the United States, the Epoch Times. And they've made documentaries about communism and all kinds of stuff. So, and the thing is, this shows now there's a division in the ruling class over Trump, right? It's pretty clear the bulk of the U.S. ruling class wants Trump out. Now, there's a minority faction in the U.S. ruling class that does not want Trump out. I talk about the lower levels of capital versus the Eastern establishment. I think a lot of the lower levels of capital have turned on Trump. But there is a minority faction that really wants Trump. And so because of this polarization, now the New York Times has done an expose of the Falun Gong and of the Epoch Times and showed that this pro-Trump media apparatus, the Epoch Times, the Epoch Times, is tied to a fanatical, dangerous cult that has destroyed many, many families. Good. And then this is kind of showing the divisions in the ruling class. When there are divisions in the ruling class, that creates openings for the people, right? 5-6 years ago, the New York Times was repeating the Falun Gong's claims. And that's what U.S. media would do. Whenever Falun Gong would get up and say, they're harvesting our organs, and the World Health Organization would look into it and say, no, they're not. And, all these international bodies would say, no, they're not. The press in the United States would treat that like a legit claim. They do the same thing with the Mujahideen Khalq in Iran, that they set up these counter gangs. That they're set up. They're fanatical cults that are set up by the CIA and the U.S. government to go after anti-imperialist countries. And U.S. media treats them as if they are legitimate, and they are not. The more you look into them, the more they see these people are nuts. It's good to see the New York Times expose the Falun Gong. The only thing I will say is that I am going to be provocative. I'm going to be provocative and say, hey, New York Times, where were you 5 or 6 years ago? Falun Gong was just as racist, just as homophobic, just as kooky, culty, and insane, just as anti-science now as they were 5 years ago. But the New York Times, when they were pandering to liberals, when they were still trying to present themselves as hippies and Eastern mystical hippies, when they were doing that, you'll notice that basically they were treated with respect by the mainstream media. But because now there is a polarization between Trump and anti-Trump, now they expose them. I think that's fascinating. And that gets me toward what I want to talk about in my opening remarks tonight, which is the late Cold War. All right? We know what the Cold War was. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union faced off globally. There are two phases of the Cold War. It was not all continuous. There was the early Cold War and there was the late Cold War. And there is a big difference between the two of them. And if you want to understand the problems in our movement, the problems in the communist movement, the problems in the socialist movement, I talk about synthetic left, people talk about the Sino-Soviet split, people talk about all of this stuff. If you want to understand the problems in the socialist and communist movement today, you can't just understand the early Cold War. You must understand the late Cold War. The late Cold War. Because By about the 1970s, the Cold War was a completely different battlefield. And in the process of this war, the Cold War being fought by two great superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, our ideology, Marxism, socialism, communism, was greatly affected. Huge things were done to Marxism. The kind of Marxist books that you find that are available, the kinds of things people believe about Marxism and socialism, all of it has been hugely impacted by the late Cold War. So if you are going to understand the Marxist and communist movement as it exists today and why it is so gosh darn confusing, you need to understand the late Cold War. And to be honest, most communists in the world today don't really understand the late Cold War. Most of them kind of understand it a little bit, but they really haven't completely digested what went on. The late Cold War, the events that led to the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Eastern Bloc, the geopolitical games that went on post-1970, the way international politics and the geopolitical conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union shifted dramatically after the U.S. defeat in Vietnam, after the political crisis in the United States of 1968 to 1972. That has hugely impacted our movement. So if you want to understand why we have a problem in communism in the United States and internationally, if you want to understand why I've been telling people we have to change the way we operate, you need to understand the late Cold War versus the early Cold War. Folks, the early Cold War is elementary school. It's elementary school stuff. It's easy to understand, right? So Nazis are defeated. USA and the Soviet Union say, hey, we're going to be best friends forever. But, obviously Wall Street and the imperialists are not going to be best friends forever with the Soviet Union. And all over the world, because the communists were key in defeating fascism, they are growing in big numbers. There's a big communist party in Japan, right? There's a big communist party in Italy. There's a big communist party in France. There's a big communist movement in Britain. There is a big communist movement in Germany. All over the world, right? And all over the world, because the communists were known as anti-fascist fighters, there is a huge surge in support for communism. The Soviet Union kicked Hitler's ass, okay? The Soviet Union took Berlin, unfurled the hammer and sickle flag over Berlin. They liberated Auschwitz, right? And the Soviet Union and communism are like speeding ahead, coming out of the Second World War. So you have the Korean War, for example, right? And the Korean War is the first big defeat for the United States, right? Whereas the United States thinks it's going to drive communists out of the Korean Peninsula, and China gets involved, right? The USA gets involved in the Korean War, and then China gets involved, and the USA panics, and Douglas MacArthur threatens to drop atomic bombs on China, and China doesn't care, and they send troops in there, and Mao's own son dies in the fighting, and they drive the United States back to the 38th parallel. It is huge. It's a huge moment, the Korean War, right? And the Soviet Union is supporting North Korea. China is supporting North Korea. It's huge, right? The black liberation struggle in the United States is something that communists are supporting, right? And in the United States, right, Martin Luther King, he's not become a political figure until like 1954. But at the time of the Korean War, 1940s, if anyone got up and said civil rights, they immediately said communist, right? Because everybody knew that the Communist Party was the most heavily involved in the civil rights movement. There was something called the Civil Rights Congress that was created, a whole activist group led by the Communist Party that fought for black people's rights. And it was mainly black people who led the organization. William L. Patterson, Henry Winston, Claudia Jones, Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois. All these intellectuals are associated with the Communist Party, and they are fighting against racism. And with the help of the Soviet Union, they get up at the United Nations and they read this, this document they published. We charge genocide documenting the crimes against black people in the United States. And this document is read to the whole UN body. This document written by American communist civil rights activists. The Soviet Union makes that happen. And the black freedom struggle in the United States is associated with communism. The United States, it fought Hitler during World War II, but all of a sudden it's making friends with all these fascists, the monarchy in Greece and, all kinds of Nazis and Nazi sympathizers are like making peace with the United States. You have, Operation Paperclip and all, because the United States, hey, fascists are fine as long as they're killing Reds. Right, and so the United States is propping up all kinds of brutal dictatorships. You have the dictatorship that's set up in South Korea by Syngman Rhee. You have the corrupt regime in South Vietnam that is set up, and all over the world, dictatorships in Latin America are being set up. All over the world, the United States is backing brutal dictators because, hey, at least they kill communists. Communists are saying we're the anti-fascists, we're the anti-racists, we're the anti-imperialists. The early Cold War makes absolutely perfect sense. And all over the world, there's a surge of interest in communism. Communist groups are growing by leaps and bounds. The United States it's about like the Spanish Inquisition, right? While the Reformation was sweeping Europe. Socialists in IRA, okay. All right. While the Reformation was sweeping Europe, right? Spain was a stronghold of the Roman Catholic Church. And so Spain, because it's the only place the Catholic Church is really strong, they launched the Inquisition, and they just start cracking down on anybody in Spain who might have any dissident idea, right? Anybody who might do anything that might be a threat to the Catholic Church, because this is their stronghold. McCarthyism in the United States is the Spanish Inquisition for capitalism, because all over the world, capitalism is either being defeated or it's on the defensive, right? I mean, it's been overthrown in China, it's been overthrown in Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, it's been overthrown all across Eastern Europe. There's revolutionary movements rising in Latin America, there's revolutionary movements rising in Africa, all over the world, communism is on the defensive is rising and on the offensive. And so in the United States, there's McCarthyism, right? And it's just, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and anybody who says anything communist is arrested or is blacklisted, and, the FBI is following around Communist Party members and making sure they can't keep a job, and there's 200 or so members that are just locked in jail simply for being members of the party, and, that is the early Cold War. Makes perfect sense. And of course, communists, despite the fact that they're outlawed and underground, they're leading civil rights marches, they're organizing, and they're opposing. They have rallies against the Korean War that are like secret rallies they organize. You can read about some of that heroic organizing that's going on. That's the early Cold War. But there was a bit of a problem. And I think that the beginning of the shift in the Cold War was during the Korean War. There was the beginning of what you can call the brainwashing craze, right? And I don't know if folks have ever seen the movie The Manchurian Candidate. Not the remake, but the original, The Manchurian Candidate. It was a very popular movie. It's about some, member of Congress or politician who's been brainwashed by the communists, right? And he's just a normal guy, but then they show him like a card from a deck of cards, and they recite some words to him, and then he like turns into a communist robot, and he's like, must obey communists. And the idea is that he was taken prisoner as a prisoner of war, and the communists did some like voodoo magic to his brain, and then so whenever they want, they just show him this card, and he goes, must die, must obey Stalin. It's like the stupidest thing, right? So but what was that based on? Well, that movie was inspired by the fact that during the Korean War, there were a number of American soldiers who got taken prisoner by the Korean communists and the Chinese communists. And they were taken prisoner, and a number of them became communists in the prisoner of war camp. And American media just couldn't understand that. Why would this happen? These were wholesome, good American boys, farm boys from Iowa and Kansas, good, patriotic young men who loved America, and they get captured by the communists, and all of a sudden they're just like, And they would read statements. They would show them on television, reading statements denouncing American imperialism and all this. How could this happen, right? I mean, how could this possibly happen? Well, what happened, right? Well, I mean, you read, there was a number of documents that were published. The CIA is obsessed with this. This can't be happening, right? I mean, how could these people become a communist? So Robert J. Lifton, who is the brainwashing expert for the CIA, he does all these, he's like an academic, right? There's Edgar Sheen, and all kinds of academics start studying this. How is this possible? And they interview people that have been held captive in communist prison camps. How is this happening? How is this happening? Well, what happens is keep in mind, there was a U.S. Army general who was captured by the North Koreans. Now, he never became a communist, but he was convinced of a lot. I mean, you read his autobiography, it's not completely anti-communist. It's mixed, right? He was confused when he came back, when he was finally handed back after the Korean War was over. He was confused, right? He was not a full communist, but he was confused, right? So, but then there were like CIA people who were captured who they never were able to convince of anything. So what happened, right? Well, if you look at the process, what was done? How was it that these American guys, how was it that they ended up becoming communists in the prison camp? Well, what did they do? Well, the process usually went like this, right? They would sit them down, right? So they're in this prison. They would sit them down, and they would just tell them about the evil things of American imperialism, right? They would show them the picture of Emmett Till, the black, young man who was lynched, for allegedly whistling at a white woman. They'd show the picture of the mutilated corpse. They would show how the United States had bombed civilians during the Korean War, killed innocent people. They would show how the CIA or the people who eventually would go on to found the CIA, Alan Foster Dulles and others, had made statements to the effect of the USA should join with Hitler against the Soviet Union. And they would just show these guys things that completely contradicted their worldview. Right? These guys were true believers in American capitalism, right? That America was the greatest country in the world. Capitalism is the greatest system. Communism is pure evil, and it's not Christian. And they get these conservative guys, these average conservative American guys who had a one-track mind, right? Who thought of the world in a black and white sense, right? There was the United States, capitalism, Christianity were all good. Communism, all evil. And they thought in a black and white way, right? Everything was black or white to these guys. And that was how most Americans thought at the time. Everything was black and white, right? Communists, all bad. Capitalism, American capitalism, all good. That's how they thought, period. You'd get a guy like that. And you would sit him down and you would just browbeat him. Show him the picture of Emmett Till. Show him the picture of people bombed. Get him to just understand it. Get him to just see all of this, face reality. Show him that the New York Times said just not let him go until finally the guy has a breakdown, right? Because his whole worldview is that, he'd sit there, you'd show him the picture of Emmett Till and his mutilated body. He'd be like, that's a lie. America is good to black people. That could never happen. American imperialism would never, no, the Americans would never treat black people like this. Nope, it's true, and just, and just get him to admit all the evil things that American capitalism has done around the world, until finally he would just crack. And at the point that he cracks and recognizes that the United States is guilty of racism and genocide and mass murder, right? The way this guy's mind works is it's a light switch. It's black and white thinking. So the United States was all good. Racism was made up. The U.S. government never has killed. So you get him to finally crack, and it's like a light switch. It's either on or off. Click, he's a communist. And you read the writings of people who study this. The CIA was blown away by this. That they would get Americans who were just McCarthyite, anti-communist conservatives, who had this black and white mentality. And with that black and white mentality, it was very easy, if you just worked on them hard enough, to get them to crack. And they would just, it was like if that's how your mind works, if it's all black and white, if it's all good and evil, if American capitalism does nothing wrong and is the perfect system, and a communism is all pure evil, all you have to do is crack and destroy one side of the argument. The other one becomes de facto true. And that was what was going on. That's why these American GIs were quote unquote brainwashed. They weren't being brainwashed. It was just that they had a black and white, true believer, blind belief in American capitalism. And if you got them into a situation where they could not escape the reality of the evils of American capitalism, as a result, they would become communists, right? And a lot of them, I mean, it just shows how I guess malleable is the word, that they would be communists in the prison camp, and then they'd get traded back, and then, once they were back in the United States, they would sit them down, and they would, switch back to being, I mean, it was like, when you get people who don't think with a lot of depth, but think in terms of good versus evil, black versus white, if you get them in that situation, it's very easy to click, to switch their minds. So, that was going on. And, there was this obsession with brainwashing in American culture. And it was, you read there was stuff published by, there was a British psychologist who talked about all of this. It was a big thing because it was this obsession. And there was a realization on the part of American intelligence and on the part of very powerful forces in the United States, that if they maintained the McCarthyist model in the United States for too much longer, right? If the United States ever entered a crisis, right? The economy was booming in the 1950s in the United States. Highest standard of living in the world at that time. No one had ever been wealthy. But if the United States entered some kind of crisis, and people were very angry at the government, and people were rising up and revolting and protesting, under such circumstances, people would automatically become communists, because the way Americans were being trained to think was in this pure black and white, good or evil mindset, right? And that if you set up that kind of dichotomy where there's only good and evil, where there's no middle ground, right? If you set that up, sure, when the economy is booming, when U.S. society is very stable, sure, that'll be fine. But when the crisis comes, if millions of people are starving, if there's a civil war, or there's, huge uprisings, you're going to get a situation where, as default, millions of people are going to become communists. And they saw that in the black community, that was already happening. There were millions of black people in the United States who were not members of the Communist Party, but thought highly of the Communist Party. Why? Because the American government hated them. You should read, when he was in prison, I believe Malcolm X, who later joined the Nation of Islam, wrote all kinds of letters to the U.S. president praising Mao, praising communism. He wrote these crazy letters. He was having some kind of breakdown. And in the black community, there was a huge amount of admiration for the Communist Party, for Mao, for Stalin, because for no other reason than the black people hated the United States government for what it was doing to them in terms of racism. And there had been set up this dichotomy where you're with us or you're with the communists. And so all kinds of people in the black community were sympathetic to the communists, right? And that this was happening all throughout the United States, and that they realized that the McCarthyism was setting up a situation where if the domestic situation in the United States were to shift, millions of people would automatically become communists. So, at that point, the early, late 50s, early 60s, you start to see the U.S. government start working very, very hard